I think, like many people, I first became fascinated by the antiquities in Sigmund Freud's collection by visiting this wonderful museum and seeing them on display. I must have done that quite a long time ago, not long after the museum opened, and possibly still at the time when I was working myself as a museum curator. So I immediately noticed the Chinese objects in the collection, and I noticed their absence from the literature that people had written about Freud and his collection. There was a lot about Freud and antiquity, but it focused, perhaps understandably, on the much larger number of Greek and Roman and Egyptian objects that the collection holds. The Chinese stuff just wasn't noticed, and I became intrigued about this. I started to do a bit more reading about Freud, a bit more reading about his collecting habits, and I started to think about the ways in which the Chinese objects perhaps revealed for us another side of Freud that hadn't been examined fully up to now. So putting together this exhibition has been an enormous privilege, an opportunity to think about all the objects in the collection, and also an object to focus in on ones that I've found particularly interesting or particularly important. And now I'd like to talk about 5 separate objects on display in the exhibition that all in their individual ways show us aspects of Freud's engagement with Chinese objects and with the thought and ideas behind them. I think my favorite object of the antiquities is a bronze head. It's a bronze head of a Ming Dynasty figure. It may be that just the Ming Dynasty is the period of Chinese art that I've worked on most and written most about, so it's a kind of familiar object. When I see it, it's like a familiar friend in the collection. But I'm gripped, the more I look at it, by the ambiguity in its expression. This is a fierce object. It's the head of a Buddhist protector deity. So it's a deity who is shouting out in rage to terrify evil spirits and scare them away. But it also, in one level, looks like a figure in pain, looks like a figure of somebody suffering. And you can't help but think not only about Freud's own suffering at the late stage of his life when he lived in this house, when he was a very ill man, but also about Freud's mission to relieve suffering, about the role that psychoanalysis and other forms of therapy have dealt with in dealing with mental health. And it may be that in working on this topic over the last few years, over the pandemic, when issues of anxiety, mental health, mental anguish have been very much to the forefront of everybody's thinking, this has seemed a more and more intense and poignant object in many ways. I think another favorite object of mine, it's not an object, but I'm gripped and very moved in a way by the existence in the collection of Freud's own copy of a book that is the Chinese translation of his introductory lectures on psychoanalysis, lectures which he himself had delivered for the first time during the First World War. And then in the early 1930s, he receives a copy of the Chinese translation of this, and he writes in his diary, his very brief diary, he simply writes the words Chinese lectures. So we know exactly when these lectures got to him. And I think the fact that he brought these lectures with him when he brought the library from Vienna, again, to me, that's a very moving testimony to the long-standing nature of the Chinese interest in Freud. This isn't something, the Chinese interest in Freud isn't something that's just started in very recent years, but goes right back into the period of Freud's own life. And this volume, this book, stands as a testimony to that. And you can't help but think about other people in China who might have read this volume, read this translation, and what it might have meant to them, what it might have made them think about, how it might have helped them, how it might have baffled them. And so as somebody who's long been interested in the culture of China and the way that cultures have cultural ideas have gone back and forth across the world. This again speaks to me very powerfully. One of the objects featured in the exhibition is a small jade screen which sat right in the middle of the objects on Freud's desk in his apartment in Vienna, and which sat in the same position right in the middle of his desk here in Maresfield Gardens in London. The importance of this object came to me thinking about the exhibition when I realized that it was one of the two objects that Sigmund Freud got his friend Marie Bonaparte to smuggle out of the apartment in Vienna after the Nazis had taken over Austria, and at a point where Freud was facing the possibility that his entire collection of art and antiquities would be seized by the state. And so he had Marie Bonaparte smuggle two objects out of the apartment. One of them is a small ancient Greek bronze figure of the goddess Athena, figure of goddess of rationality, of the intellect. And so it's very easy to understand the place that that played in Freud's life and thinking. But this small jade screen is a slightly more enigmatic object. But what I think is important is that we come to realize that at the point that Freud realized or feared that he might lose everything and took steps to save at least two things. One of those two things, 50% if you like, of the minuscule collection that he might have been left with, one of those two things was Chinese. And although we don't know exactly what the Chinese objects in the collection meant to Freud, he didn't write about this, he wasn't explicit about it, the fact that he took these steps to preserve one of the Chinese objects, I think tells us something or gives us a hint of something about the importance that these objects played for him. Several of the larger Chinese antiquities in Sigmund Freud's collection are earthenware ceramic figures in the style of the Tang period. That's the period of Chinese history more or less 1,000 years before Freud's own time. Most of Freud's Tang figures are not in fact genuine, but are modern copies made for the collector market. We don't know which one of these was the first figure that he acquired, but we do know that in October 1931, he writes in his diary, Tang figure bought. A quite tall figure of a Central Asian merchant. That is, it's a figure with a face that to Chinese eyes is very much related to the West, to Western Asia. The figure has a large bristly beard, a large hooked nose, very distinctive Western Asiatic features. This might sound a bit far-fetched, but in installing the exhibition, one of the things that struck us as we did it was the way in which this figure almost resembles Freud himself. Now, of course, we've got no proof, and it's as I say, a bit far-fetched to imagine that Freud bought this figure because he recognized it as a self-portrait. That would be going too far. But we do know that Freud was very sensitive to and aware of racial characteristics among the objects in his collection. And so it's by no means impossible that he thought about this and was aware of it. We certainly know that other collectors of these kind of figures thought about these kinds of things at this time. So this object, again, gives us a clue about some of the ways in which the Chinese objects that Freud bought might have connected to other things that he was thinking about in his life or in his work. There's a piece of jade and gold jewellery in the exhibition which we know belonged to Anna Freud, Freud's youngest daughter, and in many ways his intellectual heir. She was, of course, a very famous and important psychoanalyst in her own right, and lived in this house here in Maresfield Gardens right up to the end of her life in 1982. We think of Freud as a rather austere and withdrawn person, but in many ways Freud loved jewelry. He loved small, shiny, sparkly objects. He was forever giving gifts of jewelry to people who were important to him in his life, to his friends, to members of his family. And we know that he gave Anna jade and jade jewelry on a number of occasions. So this object has a very close personal collection, not only with Sigmund Freud himself, but with the other famous inhabitant of this house, his daughter Anna Freud.